Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today we're going to dive into something that might not sound super exciting at first glance.
Oh, really? Tell me more.
Well, we are taking a look at petroleum refining.
Okay, I see what you mean.
Go- I promise you, it's way more interesting than it sounds.
Oh, I bet it is. I'm sure there's a lot more to it than most people realize.
Exactly. And to help us, we've got a super in-depth tutorial on petroleum refining.
Nice. Full of all sorts of diagrams and explanations.
Yeah. So by the end, you'll know exactly how those ultra-low sulfur fuels that keep our cars humming are made.
From start to finish.
Yep. And, understanding this, it can actually help you understand things like gas prices, environmental impact, maybe even things to consider when buying a car.
That's a great point. It's all connected in a way.
It really is. So first things first, let's take a step back and talk about crude oil. What is it really?
Crude oil. It's not just some simple liquid.
It's not.
No, it's a complex mixture of, get this, thousands of different hydrocarbon compounds.
Thousands. Wow, okay. And hydrocarbons, those are just molecules made up of hydrogen and carbon, right?
Yeah, exactly. But the thing is, it's how those carbon and hydrogen atoms are arranged, the structure of the molecules, that determines their properties.
And their value, I'm guessing?
Exactly. Some molecules are more valuable than others when it comes to making fuels and other products.
So it's like crude oil is this giant puzzle, and each hydrocarbon compound is a piece of that puzzle.
Perfect analogy. And like any puzzle, some pieces are easier to work with than others.
So I'm guessing that means some types of crude oil are easier to refine than others.
You got it. And that's where those two key characteristics come into play, API gravity and sulfur content.
API gravity, that's basically the density of the oil, right?
Yep. And sulfur content, well, that tells us how much sulfur is mixed in with the oil.
So I'm following you correctly. Lighter crude oils, they're like easier to refine.
Exactly. They're like those pre-chopped veggies you get at the store, ready to go.
Makes sense. Whereas heavier crude oils, those are more like a big unpeeled potato.
You need to put in a lot more work to get something good out of it.
Gotcha. And lighter crudes, they usually have more of those smaller hydrocarbon molecules that are used to make gasoline and diesel and such, right?
Right on. They're like the prime cuts of the crude oil world.
Interesting. But our source mentioned something about the world relying more and more on those heavier, more sulfur-rich crude oils.
It's true. And that brings a whole new set of challenges to the refining process.
Does that mean our fuels are going to get more expensive?
Well, it certainly adds to the complexity and cost of refining. Heavier crude oils, they need more processing, more energy, more specialized equipment to get those valuable fuels out.
That's something to think about next time I'm at the pump.
So let's talk about the refineries themselves. What exactly goes on in those massive places?
Imagine a city, but instead of houses and shops, it's all about transforming crude oil.
Whoa, a city dedicated to turning crude oil into what we use every day?
Yeah, that's a refinery for you. It's
Oh.
an intricate network of interconnected processes all working together. And we learned that there are different types of refineries, too.
That's right. They're classified based on their complexity, you could say.
So some are simpler, some are more advanced.
Exactly. Like topping refineries, they're the most basic. They just separate the crude oil into its different fractions, kind of like sorting laundry.
Okay, and then there's hydroskimming refineries, right? They can do a bit more.
They can do some upgrading of naphtha to make gasoline, and they have ways to remove some sulfur.
But the real heavy hitters are the conversion and deep conversion refineries, right?
You got it. Conversion refineries, they crack those heavy fractions into lighter ones, making them more valuable.
Yeah.
And deep conversion refineries, well, they can even break down the heaviest, stickiest residue into lighter products.
It's amazing what they can do. And it's no wonder that most U.S. refineries fall into those two categories, considering how much gasoline and diesel we use. Okay, so we've talked about the types of crude oil and the different types of refineries. But how do we actually get those ultra-low sulfur fuels out of this complex mix?
Well, it's kind of like a carefully choreographed dance, with each refinery using a unique combination of different processes, each with its specific purpose.
A dance, huh? I like that analogy. So let's imagine we're stepping into one of those massive conversion refineries. What kind of moves are we talking about?
All right, picture this. 4 main categories of moves: cracking, upgrading, treating, and blending.
4 main moves. Let's break it down, starting with cracking. What's that all about?
Cracking is all about taking those large hydrocarbon molecules and breaking them down into smaller ones.
So it's like splitting them apart. Why is that so important?
Because those smaller molecules are what we need to make gasoline and diesel.
Makes sense. And are there different ways to crack those molecules?
You bet. There are several types of cracking, each with its own advantages and, well, quirks. But when it comes to making those ultra-low sulfur fuels, two types of cracking are really important. Fluid catalytic cracking, or FCC, and hydrocracking.
Okay, FCC and hydrocracking. Let's start with FCC. What happens during that process?
So FCC is like the workhorse of the refinery. It takes a heavy fraction called gas oil and cracks it into lighter components that can be blended into gasoline and diesel.
Sounds pretty important. But you mentioned quirks earlier. What's the catch with FCC?
Well, while FCC is great at producing those valuable components, it also creates some byproducts that contain sulfur.
So that's where the sulfur challenge comes in.
Exactly. And that's where hydrocracking comes into play.
Hydrocracking, that sounds pretty intense. What's so special about it?
Well, hydrocracking is more expensive than FCC, but it has a big advantage. It not only cracks those heavy fractions, it also removes sulfur at the same time.
Whoa, a two-for-one deal. So it's like a more efficient, albeit more expensive way to crack those molecules and tackle a sulfur problem.
You got it. So we've got FCC, which produces those valuable components but introduces some sulfur. And then we've got hydrocracking, which is a bit pricier but tackles both cracking and sulfur removal head on. Pretty neat, huh?
It really is. It's fascinating how these different processes play such specific roles in the refinery. So what's next after cracking? What other moves are in this dance?
Well, after cracking comes upgrading. This step focuses on improving the quality and value of the gasoline components.
So we're talking about making those high-performance gasolines that car enthusiasts love.
Precisely. Upgrading produces those high-octane components that are essential for making premium gasolines.
I see. And one of the key upgrading processes is catalytic reforming, right?
That's right. Catalytic reforming takes a stream called naphtha and transforms it into something called reformate, which is a major ingredient in gasoline.
So it's like taking a basic ingredient and turning it into something more valuable and useful.
You got it. And what's really cool is that catalytic reforming also produces hydrogen as a byproduct.
Wait, didn't you say that was important for removing sulfur earlier?
Bingo! You're catching on quickly. Hydrogen is a crucial ingredient in the next category of processes called treating. And hydrotreating is all about removing sulfur from those different refinery streams.
It's amazing how everything is connected in the refinery.
It really is. It's like a carefully orchestrated symphony, each process playing its part to create the final product.
So tell me more about this hydrotreating. What exactly does it do?
Hydrotreating uses hydrogen to react with those sulfur compounds in the different refinery streams and essentially remove the sulfur.
So it's kind of like a purifying process.
Exactly. And it's used extensively throughout the refinery, not just for making ultra-low sulfur fuels, but also for protecting those sensitive catalysts and other processes.
So it's a multitasker. It makes the fuels cleaner and helps keep the whole refinery running smoothly. Okay, so we've got cracking to break down the molecules, upgrading to boost quality, and hydrotreating to remove sulfur. What's the final move in this refinery dance?
The grand finale, product blending. This is where all those different refinery streams, each with its unique properties, come together.
So blending is about combining those different streams in just the right way to create those finished fuels that meet all the necessary standards and regulations.
You nailed it. It's like a carefully crafted recipe, with each blend stock contributing its own flavor to the final product. And when it comes to ultra-low sulfur gasoline and diesel, that recipe gets even more complex and precise.
That brings us back to the challenge we talked about earlier, right? The demand for transportation fuels keeps growing, but so do the environmental regulations, pushing for lower and lower sulfur content.
Exactly. And meeting those demands requires some very specific strategies, which we'll delve into next.
This is all so fascinating. I'm really starting to understand the complexity of producing those cleaner fuels. I can't wait to hear more about how refineries meet that challenge.
Me too. There's a lot more to uncover, and it's only going to get more interesting from here.
Okay, so we've learned about crude oil and gotten a sneak peek inside a refinery, seeing how those key processes like cracking, upgrading, and hydrotreating all fit together.
It's a complex system for sure, but a fascinating one, I think.
It really is. But now, I'm really curious about those ultra-low sulfur fuels. How do refineries actually pull that off?
Well, producing ultra-low sulfur gasoline and diesel, or ULSG and ULSD as they're known, takes a pretty targeted approach.
I bet. And our source mentions two specific processes, FCC naphtha hydrotreating and distillate hydrotreating.
Right. Those are two key players in the sulfur reduction game.
They sound pretty technical. Can you break them down for us?
Absolutely. Remember how we talked about FCC, fluid catalytic cracking, being that workhorse in the refinery?
Yeah, the one that cracks the heavy gas oil into those lighter components for gasoline and diesel?
Right. Well, one of the products from FCC is called FCC naphtha, and it turns out that stuff is a big source of sulfur in gasoline.
Ah, so that's where FCC naphtha hydrotreating comes in. It's specifically designed to deal with that stream.
You got it. FCC naphtha hydrotreating can remove over 97% of the sulfur from that FCC naphtha, getting it down to those ultra-low levels needed for ULSG.
97%. That's amazing. So FCC naphtha hydrotreating takes care of the gasoline side. What about diesel? Is that where distillate hydrotreating comes in?
You're on a roll. Distillate hydrotreating focuses on all those different streams that are blended together to make diesel fuel.
So things like straight-run kerosene, light cycle oil, and coker distillate.
Exactly. All those streams need to be treated to meet the ultra-low sulfur requirements for ULSD.
So basically, producing those cleaner fuels hinges on these specialized hydrotreating processes.
You could say that. They're essential for meeting those stringent environmental regulations.
And remember how we talked about those stay-in-business investments? The ones that refineries have to make just to comply with the rules, not necessarily to make more profit.
Yeah, those upgrades that are necessary but not always exciting.
Well, it seems like these hydrotreating processes are often part of that category.
You're absolutely right. It really highlights how environmental regulations have a direct impact on refining and the cost of fuel.
It's definitely a complex issue with a lot of different factors at play. And speaking of cost, our source goes into the economics of producing these cleaner fuels. It turns out there's more to it than just the cost of those hydrotreating units.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot more to consider.
Like what? What other costs are involved in making those ultra-low sulfur fuels?
Well, for starters, refineries need a lot of hydrogen for those hydrotreating processes. And guess what? Producing hydrogen takes energy, often from natural gas, which adds to the overall cost.
Right, it's all connected.
Yeah,
So more hydrotreating means more hydrogen production, which means higher costs. Are there any other hidden costs we should know about?
you bet. There's something called yield loss. Every time you run a process like hydrotreating, you lose a little bit of the product.
I guess that makes sense. You can't remove impurities without losing a tiny bit of the good stuff, too. But even a small loss probably adds up when you're dealing with millions of barrels of oil.
You're telling me. And for gasoline, there's another thing to consider. Remember how we talk about FCC naphtha containing those olefins? Well, doing hydrotreating, those olefins get saturated, which lowers the octane rating of the gasoline.
Now, that's interesting. So refineries have to find a way to make up for that octane loss.
Exactly. And that usually means turning up the dial on other processes, like catalytic reforming, which adds even more to the cost.
Wow. It's incredible how one little change can trigger a whole chain reaction of effects and costs. It's like a domino effect. But hold on. Our source mentioned something that seems a bit counterintuitive. Energy use in U.S. refineries actually went up after those stricter sulfur regulations came in. I thought cleaner fuels were supposed to mean less energy use, not more.
Yeah, it seems strange at first, right? But it makes sense when you think about all those hidden energy costs associated with producing cleaner fuels. You need more hydrogen, which takes energy to make. You have to compensate for those yield losses and octane losses, which takes more processing and more energy. It all adds up.
So it's like a balancing act, right? Trying to reduce emissions from the fuels themselves, but potentially increasing emissions from the production process.
It definitely highlights the complexity of the whole system and the trade-offs involved.
This has been such an eye-opener. It's amazing how interconnected everything is in the refining world. A seemingly small change can ripple through the whole process and have some pretty big consequences. But I keep coming back to this question. What does all of this mean for us, the everyday people filling up our cars?
That's the big question, isn't it? We've talked about the technical stuff, the environmental stuff, and the economic stuff, but how does it all impact our lives?
Yeah, it's easy to forget about all the work and complexity that goes into making something we use every single day. I know I did. This deep dive has really changed how I think about filling up my tank.
I hear you. It's one of those things that's kind of hidden in plain sight, you know?
Yeah.
But it has such a huge impact on our lives. And like we've been saying, it's this constant balancing act between trying to protect the environment and keeping things affordable.
Yeah. I mean, we all want cleaner air, right?
Yeah.
We all want to do our part to help the planet.
Absolutely. But those things, well, they come with a cost. And it's not just the refineries that feel it, it's us too.
Yeah, in the end, those costs are passed down to us at the gas pump.
Exactly. And that's where it gets really tricky. We want cleaner fuels, for sure. But those regulations that make them cleaner, well, they make them more expensive to produce.
And those higher fuel costs can have a ripple effect, right? They can affect everything from how much we pay for groceries to how much it costs to ship things across the country.
Right. It's a complex system for sure. There's no easy answer. But I think the biggest takeaway here is that there are always trade-offs to consider. There's no such thing as a free lunch, especially when it comes to energy.
It's so true. So where do we go from here? What can our listeners do if they want to learn more about this stuff?
Well, the first step is just being informed. There's tons of great information out there online and in libraries. You can look up the types of refineries that operate in your area, see what they're doing.
Right. And maybe this deep dive has made some people curious about things like alternative fuels or electric cars. There's so much happening in the energy world right now.
Yeah, there's a lot of exciting innovation going on. And who knows, maybe one of our listeners will be inspired to be part of the solution, whether as an engineer, a policymaker, or just a really informed citizen.
That would be awesome. Well, we've had a blast taking this deep dive with you all today.
Me too. It's been a great conversation.
And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you learned something new. Until next time, keep those minds curious and keep exploring the world around us. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.